For most of modern history, we've been taught to believe that corn is the ultimate survival crop. It dominates fields, fuels nations, and defines food security policy. The assumption feels natural. If something covers millions of acres, it must be the most efficient way to feed people. But that assumption hides a paradox so uncomfortable it rarely gets discussed. There exists a crop that can produce roughly 3 times more calories per acre than corn under comparable conditions. Not in laboratories, not in theory. In real soil with real people depending on it to survive. For centuries, this crop functioned as a caloric insurance policy for entire populations. When grain shipments failed, when wars cut supply lines, when climate made cereal farming unreliable, this plant quietly filled the gap. Yet today, almost no one grows it at scale. It's not because it lacks calories. By dry weight, its edible yield can exceed 3,000 calories per kilogram, and its total caloric output per acre has historically surpassed that of maize when measured as food for humans rather than as industrial input. It's not because it's fragile. This crop tolerates poor soils, irregular rainfall, and minimal external inputs far better than corn ever could. So why is it absent from modern fields? Because at some point in the 20th century, agriculture stopped asking a simple question: how many people can this land keep alive? The metric quietly shifted. Calories gave way to uniformity, resilience gave way to mechanization, and crops that couldn't be neatly folded into industrial systems began to disappear, not banned, not destroyed, just slowly erased from relevance. This crop didn't fail, it was sidelined, and in the next part, we need to rewind history to understand exactly when it became indispensable and why that scared the system that replaced it. To understand why this crop mattered, you have to step back to a time when food wasn't measured in profit, but in survival. In early 19th century Europe, land was scarce, labor was abundant, and failure meant starvation. That's when this crop quietly reshaped demographics. By the 1800s, rural families in Ireland, Prussia, and large parts of Central Europe depended on it as their primary caloric base. Not because it tasted better than grain, but because it delivered something cereals could not: extreme caloric density per acre. Historical agricultural records from Prussia show yields exceeding 15–17 million calories per hectare, while corn under comparable conditions averaged closer to 6–7 million. That ratio, roughly 3:1, is the number everything else in this story revolves around. 1 acre planted with this crop could keep a family alive where grain could not. It grew underground, protecting calories from armies and weather alike. It tolerated short seasons and poor soils that maize simply failed on. During the Napoleonic Wars, when trade routes collapsed and grain prices spiked, regions relying on this crop experienced fewer famine deaths per capita than neighboring grain-dependent regions. This wasn't accidental. Governments documented it. Economists of the era acknowledged it. In 1845, a British parliamentary report openly described this crop as the most efficient known converter of land into human calories. But efficiency came with a problem. Because when a population can feed itself on small plots of land, it becomes harder to control. And that is where the story turns away from calories and toward power. The paradox only survives as long as you compare the right numbers. When you measure food the way earlier societies did human calories produced per acre, the result is blunt. Under temperate conditions, potatoes have repeatedly delivered 15–20 million calories per hectare, while corn averages 6–8 million when grown for direct human consumption. That 3:1 gap is not a rounding error, it's structural. But modern agriculture doesn't lead with that metric anymore. By the mid-20th century, the scoreboard changed. Yield stopped meaning calories and started meaning bushels. Efficiency stopped meaning nourishment and started meaning machine compatibility. Corn excels in those categories. It stands upright for harvesters' dries, predictably for storage, and feeds seamlessly into animal systems and industrial processing. Potatoes do not. They grow underground, vary in size, bruise easily, and demand human attention at harvest. When scientists compared crops using modern inputs, the framing quietly shifted again. Corn began to be measured with irrigation synthetic nitrogen pesticides and fuel already baked into the equation. Potatoes were evaluated under the same industrial assumptions, even though they historically required far fewer inputs to produce food-grade calories. On paper, the gap narrowed, not because reality changed, but because the measurement did. Water tells the same story. Calorie-for-calorie potatoes have required significantly less water than corn in rain-fed systems. Labor tells it even more clearly. A small plot of potatoes could deliver enough calories to sustain a household with fewer hours than grain demanded, so long as that labor was human, not mechanical. This is the moment the advantage became inconvenient. Once food systems optimized for tractors instead of people, the 3 times more calories fact didn't disappear. It was simply rendered irrelevant. The numbers were still true. They just weren't counted anymore. And in the next part, we'll look at what happens when a crop that feeds people better than markets quietly loses its place without ever being banned. What made this crop indispensable wasn't just how many calories it produced. It was where those calories lived and how they behaved under pressure. Unlike grain, which had to be harvested dried, transported and guarded, potatoes stored their value underground. Calories stayed hidden in the soil, insulated from weather swings, theft, and even armies moving through the land. That mattered. During prolonged conflicts and trade disruptions, households didn't need barns full of grain to survive. A few rows in the ground functioned like a living pantry. Potatoes could be harvested gradually, not all at once, stretching food security across months without specialized storage. In cold climates, they held through winter. In wet years, they resisted spoilage better than cereal crops exposed above ground. Nutritionally, they were more than calories alone. Potatoes delivered usable energy with potassium, vitamin C, and enough protein to prevent deficiency when combined with minimal supplementation. This is why entire populations survived on diets that on paper should have failed. The crop wasn't elegant, it was resilient. And resilience is difficult to monetize. From a system perspective, potatoes resisted standardization. Tubers varied in shape and size. Yields fluctuated by microclimate rather than by fertilizer schedule. Harvesting required timing and care, not just horsepower. For households, these traits were strengths. For centralized supply chains, they were liabilities. So the crop's most valuable trait, its ability to quietly stabilize human life during uncertainty, never translated cleanly into ledgers or export charts. It didn't scale up well. It scaled down exceptionally. That difference is subtle but decisive. Because once agriculture began to prioritize throughput over survival, a crop optimized for feeding people during instability no longer fit the story of progress. And that's when being essential quietly turned into being expendable. The turning point didn't arrive as a ban or a decree. It arrived as a redefinition. In the early to mid-20th century, agriculture began to reorganize around a new priority scale. Food was no longer treated primarily as a local survival asset, but as a national output, something to be standardized, mechanized, and moved across long distances at predictable cost. That difference mattered once labor became expensive and machines became cheap. Government policy followed the logic of the new system. Subsidies, research funding, and extension services flowed toward crops that aligned with mechanized throughput. Calories per acre quietly lost priority to tons per hour, acres per operator, and yield per unit of fertilizer. Under those metrics, potatoes became inconvenient. Not inefficient, just misaligned. There was another problem, less discussed, but more revealing. A household that could feed itself from a small plot of land was less dependent on centralized supply chains. Potatoes made that possible. Corn did not unless processed, transported, and redistributed through industrial systems. In an economy optimized for movement and control, self-contained food security was not a feature, it was friction. So the crop wasn't removed. It was reframed. It became labor-intensive. It became low value. It became something modern agriculture had supposedly evolved beyond. None of those labels were lies. They were selective truths chosen because they supported the direction the system was already moving. By the time this transition was complete, the 3 times more calories fact hadn't been disproven. It had been outvoted by a different definition of success. One that favored crops that moved well through machines and markets, even if they fed people less efficiently. And once that definition hardened, the final step was inevitable. The knowledge that once made potatoes indispensable began to fade from memory. What happened next didn't look like suppression. It looked like progress. The crop wasn't outlawed. Fields weren't burned. Seeds weren't confiscated. Instead, the language around it changed, and with language, memory followed. By the mid-20th century, agricultural education began telling a narrower story about success. Modern farms were defined by size specialization and output per worker. Crops that didn't scale cleanly into that narrative were quietly reclassified. Potatoes became subsistence food. They were described as backward, associated with poverty, rural stagnation, or emergency rations. None of this challenged the calorie data directly. It simply made the data feel irrelevant. Research funding reflected the same shift. Corn genetics advanced rapidly, supported by public and private investment. Potatoes received comparatively little attention outside of disease control and processing varieties. Over time, fewer agronomists specialized in optimizing them for human nutrition. Fewer extension programs taught how to integrate them into resilient food systems. The absence of new studies slowly replaced old evidence with silence. And silence is powerful. Once knowledge stops circulating, it stops feeling real. Younger generations weren't taught that a small potato plot could outproduce corn in human calories. They were taught that potatoes were inefficient, labor-heavy, and low status. The 3 times more calories figure didn't need to be disproven. It only needed to stop being repeated. This is how erasure works in functional systems. Not by confrontation, but by neglect. Not by force, but by omission. A fact unspoken long enough begins to sound like a myth when rediscovered. By the end of the century, most people assumed potatoes survived only as a side dish. The idea that they once formed the backbone of food security felt almost absurd, which sets the stage for the final question: if this knowledge was lost so easily, what would it look like to recover it, not as nostalgia, but as strategy? The recovery didn't begin with ideology. It began with necessity. As climate volatility increased and supply chains showed signs of strain, researchers started revisiting old assumptions, not to romanticize the past, but to solve present problems. When they asked the most basic question again, how many people can this land actually feed potatoes, re-entered the conversation. Modern field trials began confirming what history already knew. In cool and temperate regions, potatoes consistently delivered more edible calories per acre than corn when grown for direct human consumption. They required fewer growing days, tolerated erratic rainfall, and recovered faster from weather shocks. In marginal soils where maize yields collapsed, tuber yields often held. The 3-to-1 calorie advantage didn't vanish under modern measurement. It reappeared when inputs were counted honestly. Communities noticed before institutions did. Small-scale farmers, indigenous growers, and food security researchers began treating potatoes not as a commodity, but as a stabilizer. In regions vulnerable to import disruption, a few planted rows functioned as a buffer against price spikes and shortages. Not because potatoes replaced markets, but because they reduced exposure to them. This wasn't a return to subsistence. It was a recalibration of risk. What changed wasn't the crop. It was the frame. Potatoes stopped being judged by how well they fit industrial logistics and started being evaluated by how reliably they converted land, water, and labor into food people could actually eat. Under that lens, their supposed weaknesses, variability, underground growth, manual harvest became indicators of resilience rather than inefficiency. The knowledge had never been wrong. It had just been waiting for conditions where survival mattered again. And once that realization sets in, the final shift becomes possible, not at the level of policy, but at the level where food decisions are actually made. The most important change doesn't happen at the level of institutions. It happens much lower, where food decisions are still practical rather than ideological. When calories become the priority again, choices begin to look different. A small household plot planted with potatoes doesn't challenge the market. It simply steps slightly outside of it. On a fraction of an acre, it can deliver a meaningful share of annual caloric needs without requiring specialized equipment fuel contracts or synchronized supply chains. The numbers are modest, but decisive. Even partial self-provisioning reduces exposure to price spikes, shortages, and disruptions that no individual farmer can control. This is not about replacing modern agriculture. It's about buffering against its failures. What makes this shift powerful is how unremarkable it looks. There is no protest, no rejection of progress, no visible break from normal life. Just a different allocation of land, a different definition of efficiency. Calories counted where they matter most, at the point of consumption, not exchange. Historically, this is how resilience has always returned, quietly, through households and communities that refuse to outsource every survival function to distant systems. Potatoes fit this role precisely because they were never designed for dominance. They were designed for continuity. Once that perspective settles in, the paradox resolves itself. The question stops being why almost no one grows them at scale. The real question becomes why a system optimized for movement and profit would ever prioritize a crop that allows people to remain stable without it. And that realization leads to the final step, not action, but identity. In the end, this story isn't really about potatoes. It's about measurement, about what a system chooses to count and what it quietly stops seeing. When success is defined by speed, scale, and movement, crops that stabilize human life without demanding constant oversight will always look inefficient. Not because they fail, but because they refuse to perform for the scoreboard. The 3 times more calories figure never vanished. It remained true in soil, in weather, and in bodies that depended on it. What changed was the lens. Calories were replaced by throughput, resilience by uniformity, survival by optimization. Once those substitutions were complete, the paradox stopped sounding urgent. It became invisible. And invisibility is powerful. A fact you never hear repeated begins to feel implausible. A crop you only encounter as a side dish stops looking like infrastructure. Over time, dependence feels normal, and self-sufficiency starts to look primitive, even when history shows the opposite. But moments of stress have a way of stripping illusions down to fundamentals. When systems falter, the old questions return. How much food can this land produce? How reliably, for whom, under those conditions? The answers don't come from ideology or nostalgia. They come from numbers that never stopped being true. What this crop represents is not a rejection of modern agriculture, but a reminder that efficiency has more than one definition. Some efficiencies serve markets, others serve people. Confusing the two is how knowledge gets lost. The paradox resolves when the measure changes back, and once you see that the choice isn't about what to grow, it's about what you decide food is for.